Hello everyone, and welcome back to Feel the Pedal podcast. If you have been with us in the previous episodes, and a warm welcome if this is the first episode that you are listening to. We are at episode number 5, and Feel the Pedal podcast is still alive and well, with no signs of being dropped by the peloton. As always, I am your host, Gabriel Martins, and on episode 4, we interviewed Dr. Kevin Miller from Central Michigan University on pickle juice and the science of muscle cramping, and today we switch to a completely different field. So for those of you who have just arrived and would like to know more about this podcast and what motivates these nutritionists to do this twice a month, let me give you a little bit more of context. This is not just a podcast for cycling lovers or people who are simply curious about nutrition. Above all, this is an ode to nutritionists and to the importance that these professionals play in the performance and health of the cyclist. But please do not think me as one of the modern nutrition zealots of food purity and clean eating that wander around the internet, putting organic foods on a pedestal and criticizing everything that is processed with obsessive food-first approaches that in my view fall far from the proper context that food plays in our lives, and especially in the sports context. Radicalizing things and demonizing foods is the easy way out in nutrition, and this approach has reached the cycling world with an iron fist. So, with that said, I don't think that adding a nutritionist to a cycling team, and when I say nutritionists, I don't mean people with a coaching course or any other health-related degree such as physiotherapy, physical education, or personal trainers with an online certification of some sort. I mean those of us who have an actual degree on nutrition or dietetics. So having an actual nutritionist as part of a cycling team won't magically make the team win every race they're in, but it will maximize the chances that the riders are in their optimal health and performance for every race they're in. Just like a mechanic guarantees that the bikes are always fixed and properly adjusted, the physiotherapist helps the riders recover and relax after a hard stage, and the soigneurs help doing basically everything they can for the team. Now, imagine that the physiotherapist would switch jobs with the mechanic. What would we expect to happen? Well, part that the massage won't probably be as nice as usual, the bikes would probably tear apart at kilometer 5 and the race would be over for the riders. I know this is a radical example, of course, but it was this clumsy way of thinking that anyone on a cycling team can do the job of the nutritionist that led to some pretty basic mistakes to be made in the past years, if not decades. Nutrition can surely make miracles, but given the chaotic scenario that we were able to create in the cycling world, the incorporation of a proper sports nutrition can probably make a difference. One of the consequences of not having a nutritionist on pro cycling teams is the unfortunate topic that we are going to discuss today. Today we are talking about bone mineral density of cyclists with Dr. Nicky Keay. Dr. Keay is a medical doctor with clinical and research expertise in sports and dance endocrinology. As a research fellow at St. Thomas's Hospital London, she was part of the international medical team tasked by the IOC to develop an anti-doping test for growth hormone. Nicky has also undertaken research in dancers and more recently in cyclists to examine the effects of training on hormones, bone health, and performance. Dr. Nicky Keay has written the world's first educational website on REDS, healthforperformance.com.uk, for the British Association of Sports and Exercise Medicine. She also runs the UK first NHS REDS clinic for athletes and dancers at the Royal National Orthopaedics Hospital London. Dr. Nicky Keay is the medical advisor for Train Brave campaign, which raises awareness for REDS and eating disorders. So without further ado, let's get into today's show with Dr. Nicky Keay. Hi Nicola, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Looking forward to having a good discussion about cycling.
Yes, I am really looking forward to start tackling this topic. Such an overlooked issue that, thanks to your research, has been finally starting to get some really important attention. So, Nicola, for people who don't know you, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your academic trajectory, and what has motivated you to perform this interesting and much-needed research in cyclists?
Sure. Well, I've always been passionate about sport and also dance. And I guess that was my original motivation for actually studying medicine to a certain degree. I wanted to apply this knowledge to ultimately athletes and dancers. So that's starting at the beginning, why I studied medicine. And then I realized that so far a lot of sports medicine has been focused on injuries. And that's very important, of course, and unfortunately injuries will always be there and always occur. So it's important to try and mitigate those negative consequences. But I wanted to look more at how we could make positive changes, improvements for athletes and dancers in their performance. And so that led me to specialize in endocrinology, so the study of hormones. And that really is where I'm approaching this from my interest and absolutely fascinating topic of hormones, because those are the things that drive the adaptations to exercise. And that has led me to do quite a fair bit of research. One of my initial research studies was looking at a anti-doping test for growth hormone. And then more recently, I've done studies with dancers, and then, of course, bringing us right up to date with the cyclists, especially the male cyclists, because those guys can sometimes be neglected, the male athletes, in terms of REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport.
Yes, sure. This is a really important topic to discuss. And so just to give a little bit of context to our listeners first, today we are going to talk about an acronym named REDS. So every time you hear this acronym throughout the episode, we are referring to relative energy deficiency in sports. And this is quite a recent model, first described by the International Olympic Committee in 2014, which stems from the established female athlete triad. Evidence emerged showing that the impact of low energy availability is not only limited to the reproductive and bone health of female athletes, as in the female athlete triad. So REDS evolved to include effects of low energy availability on multiple aspects of health and performance. And furthermore, the REDS model acknowledges that these potential extensive consequences of low energy availability can impact both females and males as well, and equally all ages and levels of exercise, different athletes, from dancers to cyclists. So today we're going to focus on how bone mineral density and other health and performance parameters are being affected by REDS in cycling, and hopefully we can contribute to raise awareness to this overlooked topic affecting pro cyclists. So Nicola, as you've mentioned, you've started out by doing research with professional female dancers on bone mineral density. Could you please tell us a bit about your transition to study this subject, and what similarities do you consider that may exist between these two different athletic populations?
Sure. Well, it started off with dancers because, as I said, that's my passion. So that was an easy reason why I wanted to study the dancers. The first study I did was looking at the retired professional dancer, and I was actually quite shocked to find that some of them, even though they had retired from full-time professional career, they still had low bone density, which was, and the degree of that was dependent on their menstrual history. In other words, if they were very late starting their periods, or they'd had big gaps, amenorrhea, where their periods had stopped because of low energy availability. So that was my starting point. And then I went to the other end of the age spectrum. I looked at young dancers over a 3-year period in dance school when they start their full-time training. And I found that if they were training really intensively and not eating sufficiently, then lo and behold, this impacted their menstrual function, their hormones, and therefore their bone mineral density, how strong their bones were. And obviously that's not, if you think about it now, these young dancers are going to go on and hopefully get into professional ballet companies, and they're going to increase their training even more, and they're starting off with suboptimal bone health, so they're going to be more at risk of injury and effectively not performing to their full potential. So that's where I started with the dancers. And then, as you just said in the introduction, a lot of focus has been on the female athlete triad. And I think this is probably because in women, there's an obvious sign. If your hormones aren't working properly, your periods stop, or they become irregular, and there's a difficulty there. But in males, there isn't such an obvious sign, clinical sign. So that's why, in this area of research anyway, in terms of energy availability, that's why I think the males are lagging behind. And as you quite rightly said, it was with the description of REDS by the IOC in 2014 that now we're not ignoring half the population anymore. In other words, we're looking at the male athletes as well. And then cyclists, well, there are two reasons for cyclists. I have to say there was a personal reason. I'm not a cyclist myself, but my family, I've got a husband who's a master cyclist. He finished second in the UK last year. And my son is first cat cyclist, racer, super keen, cycling coach, aeronautical engineer. So there was some sort of family interest in cycling. But then it also occurred to me that cyclists need to be, I am going to rephrase that. Cyclists often perceive that being lightweight is essential to their performance, and we'll discuss that to a degree. It's true, it is, but that can be taken to the extreme. Therefore, they're going to be at risk of low energy availability, just like the dancers. And also, the other important factor for cyclists is the type of exercise. It's non-load bearing. In other words, it doesn't provide an osteogenic stimulus. So male cyclists, I hypothesize, were going to be at risk of poor bone health for two reasons. Number one, that's the nature of cycling, because you're sitting on your bike exercising and not putting weight through the whole skeleton. And the other reason is that emphasis on being low body weight to confer a performance advantage. So some of it was similar to the female dancers. You see, the female dancers also, you have to be lightweight. If you're doing point work and you're doing pas de deux, for the female, you certainly have to be lightweight, but also for the males, because they've got to jump high. So you can see there is some similarity between the athletic aspect of dance and the performance aspect, and also the cyclists. I suppose also you could argue cyclists, they're going to be wearing a skin suit. So, also the aesthetic as well. They might want to look good and be self-conscious about that. But in their case, it was obviously more driven by what they perceive to be the performance advantage of being lightweight, and therefore potentially restricting intake and potentially putting their bones at risk. But no one really, had been some studies, to be fair, that have, shown this to a certain degree, but I wanted to do a more extensive, in-depth analysis, and including an intervention arm of the study, which we'll come on to see what we can do to prevent this.
Okay, sure. And thank you for addressing such an important subject. And it's quite a comparison that people normally don't think about, to compare cyclists to dancers, but they have this in common. They have this worriness about being always lightweight. As a sports nutritionist following cyclists more at an amateur level, I feel that they are starting from an early age to develop this need to just cut food. I just have to cut
and it's
food.
a culture, unfortunately. Yes. That's the downside. Mm-hmm. And it also applies to dancing as well, by the way. But in cycling and some other sports, the culture, the emphasis, or the belief that you have to, or it's normal, or it's acceptable to restrict your intake. And listen, let's be realistic. You're not going to get up a mountain very easily if you are, massively overweight. But on the other hand, most dancers and cyclists who are a serious level, even at the amateur level, are already going to be lightweight to start with. That's why they're good at it and they enjoy it. And so, it's really that balance of benefits. Are you going to get that much better by being a little bit lighter and restricting your intake? Well, that's what we're going to discuss in the study, right?
Yes, for sure. And of course, when we consider the weight, we refer to the power to weight ratio that is on the pedestal of cycling, and it may be an important factor in dancers as well. But this, alongside with the fact that almost no sports nutritionists are following or doing a close following of the cyclists in the cycling world still. This generates a problem, and it's quite dangerous that they engage in such behaviors by themselves. And that's, of course, it's a great first step that we can at least identify this and raise awareness. So Nicola, about the first research on this topic that caught my attention, this was a paper published last year on the British Medical Journal. Could you please tell us a bit more about the authors that were part of this work as well?
Yeah. Oh, the next author, I have to admit, is my husband, Gavin Francis, because handily for me, well, first of all, he's a very keen cyclist, as I just described. He's also a mathematician. So he can really cut into the statistics and knows where, what we need to look into in detail. And then the other co-author is Dr. Karen Hind. She's a colleague working at Durham University in the sports science and exercise department, which is where I'm also an honorary fellow. And her expertise is in bone mineral density, bone health, particularly in athletes. So you can see we made it's a good team. I'm the medical doctor. My husband is the mathematician and the insights into cycling. And then we have the scientist who knows everything there is to know about bone mineral density in athletes.
Yeah, that truly is the great combination.
Dream team, right?
Yes, a dream team,
yeah.
For sure. So, Nicola, could you please briefly tell us a little bit about the study itself, the subjects, the parameters that you've studied? What have you considered to be the definition of chronic low energy availability, and what were the results found on bone mineral density and other parameters?
Sure. Well, we've been talking a lot about REDS, and the etiology of REDS is low energy availability. So, energy availability is defined as the amount of energy you have left over, if you will. Once so all the energy you take in from your food is partitioned. The first, it's preferentially used for fueling your training load, your training demands. And then the residual energy is used just to keep your body, just for sort of housekeeping tasks in your body, just for basic physiological function to keep you alive. Because even if you lie in bed all day, obviously you're going to use up a certain amount of energy. So if you're not taking enough in to cover the training demands and keep healthy, that's known as low energy availability. Now how are you going to measure that? Theoretically, we could measure how much food you take in. We could measure how much energy you're expending, what's your basal metabolic rate. But you can see that's going to be a really, really laborious process. And also Louise Burke, who's a very leading scientist in this topic in Australia, she points out that actually it's fraught with inaccuracies, difficulties, objective issues, all sorts of things. So how else are we going to assess this in the athlete to see if they're at risk of REDS? Now, in the female athlete, it's pretty a little bit more straightforward. Like I said, we have the clinical indication of menstrual cycles, and also there's a thing called LEAF, the Low Energy Availability Questionnaire for females. But there is nothing for male cyclists. And also my other slight concern is that there's nothing that's sport specific, because the questions I'm going to ask a cyclist about their training and their FTP and all those sorts of things is going to be totally different to what I ask a dancer. I'm going to be asking them about, their jumps, and it's totally different. So that's why I devised this sport-specific energy availability questionnaire and interview. That's what the I stands for, interview, because I'm a medical doctor and clinical practice is so important on talking to people and getting the information from them. Because if you give someone a questionnaire, then they are going to be very biased to try and please you and tick all the questions. So if you got everyone to fill in this questionnaire, you would think there was no problem at all. REDS does not exist if we give a questionnaire to people. Sure. So I devised a questionnaire to ask, number one, specifically about their cycling, their training load and their nutritional habits, all this sort of thing. But also then I combine that with an interview to really dig down and get some detail about that and just see their thought processes behind this, and also I think asking the cyclist about what is really they're passionate about, their cycling, and then you can just slip in about their eating. If you go straight in there and ask them, oh, are you concerned about your weight or something, then they're going to get like anxious and not. So the first part of the study was just very simply designing a really decent interview and questionnaire. And then also we did blood tests looking at some important hormones for the males, testosterone, and vitamin D. And then we got them on the DEXA machine. So we measured their bone mineral density at the lumbar spine and the hip, and also their body composition. So amount of lean mass and amount of percentage body fat and visceral fat as well. So our key variable was lumbar spine BMD, because it's the lumbar spine, cortical bone. So it's well recognized that is the site you have to really look at carefully, because that's going to give you the information if someone's hormones, if it's been adversely affected by low energy availability and dysfunctional hormones, etc. So given that the lumbar spine is our key variable, then Gavin, my husband, he put in all tried to see what was the most important explanatory variable for the lumbar spine BMD. Now, would it be the percentage body fat? Would it be the muscle mass? Would it be the training hours? What was it? And what it came out as being, it was my clinical call as to whether they were in energy availability, yes, adequate, or acute, or chronic. And that my call was based on the questionnaire, asking them those questions, and also me speaking to them and getting the detail of what had been happening for them. And so that's in essence what the study showed, that it sort of validated, if you will, this sort of questionnaire interview, a type approach for the cyclists. And most revealingly, it also indicated that these cyclists had really poor bone health. And those ones that were in chronic energy availability, in other words. So listen, in cycling, like you said, you have to be lightweight to, it's simple physics, isn't it? You have to be, the lighter weight you are, you're more likely to get up the mountain more easily. So fair enough. And it's well known that you can have a race weight during a limited period. Your body can sort of survive on that. But if chronically you're suppressing your body weight, keeping it low and restricting certain food types like carbs or something, that's what I'm defining as chronic low energy availability. And it was that group of cyclists that had particularly worrying low bone mineral density in the spine, which is the site for RED. So in essence, to summarize, the study found that indeed, as I was suspecting, that male cyclists are at risk of REDs, low energy availability, and that they are showing pretty striking consequences of that in terms of their bone health. There you go.
Those are really some shocking, important but shocking results that need to be taken out there, so people have some awareness of what is going on. Were you surprised by these results? Did you expect them?
I was pretty thinking that probably they would have low lumbar spine measurements for their bone mineral density. I was surprised by the extent of it, because as a group, as a whole, nearly half of them, 44%, were below what is indicated by the IOC as the sort of the warning level for bone mineral density. There's a thing called Z-score, which is age match. So obviously it would not be relevant to compare a 25-year-old to a 65-year-old. Obviously the bones are going to be different. So it's much more useful that we compare all the 25-year-olds. What's the bones like for all of the population of 25-year-olds? What is it like? And so that's what the Z-score reflects. If it's 0, it means it's exactly average. If it's positive, it's above average. And if it's negative, it's below. And the IOC have set -1 Z-score as being the level at which you start to get a little bit worried as a doctor that actually this person is at risk of fracture. And more importantly, why is it low? And often it is because of the low energy availability, i.e. REDs, okay? And so nearly half of them, 44% of them, were at or below that worrying level. So the extent of it, yes, I was surprised, shocked, those words. And even especially in the ones that were in chronic low energy availability. I mean, some of them, they were actually coming into the osteoporotic range. So, they had a very sort of generalized, for example, a 25-year-old having the bones of an 85-year-old. I mean, and this is a fit athlete, that is a concern, obviously. And if you look at the types of injury in the pro peloton, in the pro cycle stats, if you look at that injury list, the first thing that struck me was that the majority are fractures. Whereas if you're looking at rugby's or something like this, it's often soft tissue. So first of all, there's a lot of fractures happening. I know people are going to turn around and say, well, bike crashes happen. I accept that. And you fall off and you're going to, collarbone. We know that's a very common injury. But you could argue that if your bones are already in a weakened condition and you fall off, maybe you're going to sustain a more serious fracture than you would otherwise have done if your bones were in decent health. And particularly the vertebral fracture is a really, really nasty fracture. And we know that there are many pro cyclists who have sustained that sort of injury, including one that was actually in my study on a world tour team. And the reason he was able to participate in the study was because he had to take time off for surgical intervention of his vertebral fractures, you see. So, there's a serious consequence. So coming back to your original question, was I shocked? Was I surprised? Yes, in simple answer. But I don't want to make this all too negative. So now, hopefully, you're going to invite me. It's about raising awareness. It's all very well. I don't like particularly scare tactics, but nevertheless, we can't hide them away and say, oh, no, everything is fine. So that's sort of like the warning that something is not quite right. But then we have to look at what can we do to rectify? Well, number one, raise awareness. And secondly, what actually are we going to do about this in practical terms to support the health of these cyclists?
Yes, sure. And that is the main objective of this episode, is to raise awareness for the subject, not wanting to scare everyone, but of course we can't mask the problem, and the problem is real and people need to know about it. And so just out of curiosity, was the questionnaire able to identify some more risking eating behaviors or obvious eating behaviors that are normally more associated to these to the REDs, such as chronically restricting carbohydrates or not eating during long training rides, restricting foods, skipping meals, some bulimic behaviors? Were you able to identify some of these behaviors?
Yes, I mean, some had a previous history of a diagnosed eating disorder, so that was sort of quite straightforward. But some of them were the orthorexic type, in other words, avoiding carbs in general terms. And also, even though some of them, this is where the interview was important, although some of them actually on paper, they said, oh no, we're a steady weight, we haven't lost any weight. But then when you dug into it, it was like, oh yes, I haven't lost any weight apart from this massive weight loss of 10 kilograms in a very short space of time the year before, and keeping the weight artificially suppressed. So that's, I think, another little important point. Of course, if someone dramatically loses weight, that's an obvious sign. But someone might say, oh no, my weight is steady. But it's because the body has adapted. You have lost weight or restricted weight, and so your body responds to that by turning down its basal metabolic rates to save energy. And so even though you're eating not enough, you still don't actually lose weight because your body is compensating, because your body is clever. The set point is rejigged. So eating behaviors, the obvious eating disorder, the orthorexic type, avoiding carbs, and also there's a worrying trend for people, vegetarian, vegans. Listen, I don't want to start a whole argument about this, and if you're doing this for ethical reasons, I'm not argue with that. But if you're a serious athlete, you have to be very, very careful that you're doing it for that reason and not for having a reason or an excuse, if you will, to restrict. Also, the duration of the training, you're absolutely right. Cycling is such that, you're going out for a 4-hour ride. And even if you might underestimate how much food you're nutrition you're going to need during that ride. So that's almost the unintentional reds. So the intentional reds, they're going to restrict the carbs. They're going to not eat enough just on purpose. But there are those that, and there were a few in the study, that even though they weren't consciously restricting, unintentionally almost, because they were going out on very long rides, they hadn't taken enough food with them, or they hadn't been very, very meticulous about refueling within that 30-minute golden window of opportunity when you have to stock up with carb and protein to back up the training stimulus. Because if you don't do that, then your body won't have the energy to drive the hormonal endocrine changes you need to adapt to the exercise. So all sorts of different combinations and things in terms of disrupted eating pattern, or eating pattern that wasn't consistent or wasn't appropriate for the amount of training taken. And that's the key thing. You have to obviously bear in mind how much training you're doing. I mean, for someone that was sitting around watching the TV all day, maybe that's fine. Maybe they actually, frankly, I also work with diabetics, the other end, and maybe, frankly, they should be restricting their carbs. But, if you're asking your body to do a lot of training, then you've got to fuel it appropriately to get the training stimulus. And actually, one other point I just want to make here is that I know there is a paper called Fueling for the Work Required by James Morton and co. And, pointing out that you have to have on board enough energy for, as the name suggests, for the training load you want to do. And so it is an accepted practice. If you're doing a very low key session, there are instances where you could have a slightly lower carb intake. But the problem is that amateur cyclists, you get snippets of information. You hear, Chris Froome, he hasn't eaten any carbs for breakfast this morning. So then suddenly everyone thinks, oh, fine. That means if he's doing that, if I don't eat any carbs for the whole rest of the year, I will win the Tour de France. So it's taken out of context and out of, it's not monitored. I mean, James Morton is I know James Morton, and he's very, very meticulous guy, brilliant guy. And he is monitoring every single of those top cyclists really, really carefully. There's no way any of them will go into, a really bad situation of low energy availability. But of course, the amateur, as I say, wants a quick solution. And if I don't eat so much, maybe then I lose a bit of weight and whatever, then that's a quick answer to going faster. So it's taken out of context. So that was also what I gathered during the interview with my cyclists, that, almost universally, they were all under the belief, this culture, that being lighter is faster. Power to weight ratio, up to a point, of course, it's important. But that my concern is when it's taken out of context, too extreme, those are the cyclists that can run into trouble.
You've raised some really amazing points here. One of them being citing the research from Dr. James Morton, the first author. We had the pleasure of having him here on the show, Dr. Sam Impey.
Yeah.
They did this brilliant study that, for me, it's all the rationale, the framework that sports nutritionists should be working with. And of course, there are key sessions that you can perform with lower carbohydrate, and then when you have higher demanding training session, you can adapt. But the energy, of course, is always controlled, and everything is monitored. But this information is reaching us, researchers, us sports nutritionists. This is not the kind of information that is reaching the amateurs or reaching the pro peloton per se. So it's really, really important, and I really wanted, if you agree with me, Nicola, to highlight the importance of the sports nutritionist on the cycling teams, being amateur or being professional cycling teams. This is a basic part of cycling, just like mechanics, just like having a sommeur, just like having a public relations on the team. A nutritionist should be a part of the team as well, a basic part of the team that is there to monitor this kind of stuff and to make sure this really basic aspect of carbohydrate intake, of energy intake, according to physical activity, according to the key session they are performing, should be taken into account. And of course, 44% of low bone mineral density is quite an alarming number, especially when considering that male road cyclists, and we lately have been seeing an increasing number of crashes since they are exposed to an increased risk of crashing. Having low bone mineral density can, of course, increase the risk of fracture of those same bones. Could you tell us what other performance and health-related parameters could also be affected by this low bone mineral density and low energy availability?
Yeah, well, so should we go on to the next bit of the study? So we found that at the beginning, that was the baseline, early pre-season, pre-race season in March. And then from those 50 cyclists that took part, I put them into pairs according to their bone mineral density. So I matched them. So there were they had the similar starting point at the beginning of the race season for their bone mineral density. And to one of the people in the pair, I said, fine, just go away and do your own thing. Just don't make any changes. Just, go do what you normally do. To the other person, I gave some advice, some educational interventions. I advised them about fueling properly, like you've just described. Don't do excessive fasted rise, basically fuel for the work required in a nutshell. And also the recovery bit of the nutrition. And I also gave them some skeletal loading exercises to do to try to see if that would help their bone mineral density. They then went off and did their race season. And then we rescanned them and they came back and I saw them all again. I did another questionnaire and an interview with them, repeated the bloods, repeated the scans to see what was going on at the end of the race season, so about September, October. There was the first thing that struck me. I was expecting to have two groups from following them up. I was expecting them to fall into two groups. One group was going to be the group that just would carry on doing their own thing, and the other group was going to be the one that had hopefully affected the interventions that I had suggested. But what's the first surprise was that some had actually intentionally started restricting because they thought that would make them faster during the race season. So I actually ended up with three groups. Those that have restricted their nutrition, of course I would never instruct anyone to do that, off their own bat had done that. Those that had truly just not made any changes, and those that had taken on board my positive recommendations. And this is where the positive message comes. The ones that had taken on board my advice, my interventions, my educational interventions with regard to their nutrition and skeletal loading, well, first of all, from the bone point of view, their bone density had increased by 2%. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but over just a very short space of time, 2 months, that's amazing. The other thing that, from the performance point of view, which let's face it, is what all athletes and cyclists are no exception are more interested in than the bone mineral density. They want to know about their performance, let's be honest. And actually, compared to the group that had restricted, there was a difference in BC points 1 to the tune of 95 points. So those that had gone negative, potentially, theoretically, had lost 95 points, but the ones that have done the positive interventions had gained 95 race points. 95 BC race points, that's massive. That's the difference between going from a second cat to a first cat cyclist, for example. So that's not insignificant, okay? And that's really the key message, that by eating or just eating for the work required properly, sufficiently, that's going to improve not only your bones, so I'm happy, but it's also going to improve your performance. So really it's a win-win situation. Whereas really throws into question the whole cultural thing in cycling, that the only way that losing weight and not eating, restricting what you're eating is going to improve your performance. Because remember, these are all good cyclists to start with, right? They're all second cat or above. Some, as I mentioned, one was even a world tour and one has subsequently got signed to a world tour. So none of them were fat to start with. They were all pretty lean to start with, and certainly compared to the general population, I suppose we could argue the general population is maybe overweight, but anyway, their Z scores, their fat scores were really, really negative. So already they were lean. So I think that's the important point to get across. If you're already a lean cyclist, becoming even leaner won't improve your performance. It might even jeopardize your performance. And actually, you'd be far better off looking at other ways to improve your performance. My son, I mentioned, is a cycling coach, and he did a little calculation. He's also an engineer, so he likes his calculations. He did a calculation, and actually, the person that's already quite lean cyclist would probably gain more to improve their aerodynamics and reduce their coefficient of drag, rather than losing 2 or 3 kilos or whatever it is. So, and especially for races in the UK. I mean, maybe, if of course you're doing the Tour de France and you're under James Morton, I mean, just do what he says and, that's fine. But if you're an amateur, high level amateur, in the UK, we don't have Mont Ventoux, by the way, right? We have rolling courses. If you're already lean, actually, you're far better off looking at other aspects of your cycling performance, like I think you were sort of alluding to, your aerodynamics, your positioning on the bike, all your bike handling skills, all those sorts of things, rather than thinking that it's the magic solution is to lose those elusive whatever number of kilograms, you see. So that's the positive message, I hope, from this study, that you can improve your performance by taking control. And it's behavioural change that is the challenge, of course, because I wasn't asking them to take a pill or whatever. I was asking them to make a change in their behaviours. And actually that was really, really challenging. And some of them couldn't do it. Some of them went negative, like I said. So again, but hopefully the results from this study will show the cyclists is, look, you can potentially gain 95 BC race points if you take this on board and don't go crazy with your nutritional, restricting your nutrition.
Wow, I'm lost for words. I mean, this is just incredible. I believe this may be the essence of this episode right here. So just to put listeners on the same page here, Dr. Nicole is referring to a follow-up study where she did an intervention with those same subjects from the first group to try and see what were the changes in bone mineral density by inducing changes in the dietary pattern and introducing some load-bearing exercises as well. And I must confess that as a nutritionist, while reading this paper, I was surprised to see that with such a simple approach, basically with just plain nutrition recommendations, the intervention group was not only able to improve bone mineral density, but also gained, as you've mentioned, 95 BC racing points. That's, I mean, that's huge. This may tell us again that the diet errors being made by top cyclists are really basic, and maybe it's another reason to consider incorporating sports nutritionists into the sports urgently. So, Nicola, just a question that came into my mind while you were talking about the intervention. Is there a way of quantifying both the isolated and the combined effect in bone mineral density by implementing both load-bearing exercise and increased energy availability?
Yes, well, in an ideal world, it would be nice to separate those things out, but it wasn't, because I gave them as a package, because I thought that most likely they were to be effective in synergy. So, for example, even if the person was doing loads and loads of skeletal loading exercise, if they weren't fueling properly, then of course, like we've discussed, the hormones just aren't going to be there to back up those adaptive changes, because the bones, of course, are receptive to mechanical load, but also it's dependent on the hormonal milieu. So I didn't really want to separate them in that way, because I didn't think there would be so much effect. And also the other thing and equally, if you just if you do get your nutrition right, but you're not loading the skeleton, you're not providing the mechanical stimulus. So really they go hand in hand. But as it turned out in the study, because of the nature, the sort of psychology of an athlete, a cyclist, you ask them to do something, and basically they're an all or nothing sort of person. As an athlete, you'll either just totally reject it, like some of them did, and didn't do, we're going to just restrict whatever I said. And some of them who were going to take on board my recommendations, my interventions, and, would go at that wholeheartedly and take on both. So that's a very interesting question that you raise, and maybe also with numbers if one had a larger study, although ultimately, it is a behavioral thing we're asking these people to do. So you have to be realistic. That it's more likely if you give them both in and also the synergistic action of both of those things at the same time. And I think actually that's an important message, to be honest, because, people nowadays looking for the quick fix. I mean, obviously, doping being the obvious one, but, there isn't a quick fix. You have to do things, the whole thing about periodized training, the whole concept of doing a sport effectively or dancing effectively is that you can't just rely on focusing on one factor. You have to put the whole thing into context. So yeah, I think it's important that you have to consider all the aspects because your hormones are receptive to all these aspects. It's not just receptive to one change in your behavior.
The eternal search for the magic bullet striking again. And of course, not being able to put things into context and radicalizing diets just makes the cycling world more prone to this kind of behaviors. And again, how can we expect that cyclists have a balanced nutritional approach, such as fueling for the work required proposed by IMPI, or simply recovering properly, if there are no nutritionists in the sports? I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but apart from some of the World Tour teams, at least the best ones, I think, that take things more seriously, have one. I do believe that we nutritionists have been way too quiet about this. We need some change, and hopefully we can contribute to that change with this episode. So, Nicola, your study was performed in the UK. Do you think that performing this same study in other countries would result in the same outcomes?
Yeah, I think there have been some in pro cyclists in France, the young ones in the cycling academies, and also we see that to a certain extent in England. And unfortunately, there is still a certain amount of culture, the coaches wanting them to be leaner, and already you're speaking to people that are really focused, really driven, really determined, almost maybe a little bit obsessive. That's why they're an athlete, by the way. That's what makes us successful. That's what makes you a successful athlete, that's successful in life. You have to be driven and focused. But then you give someone the idea that this is what you have to do to make yourself better. So I think there have been some studies in France also. Similar thing. But we also have that in England, even though, as I say, we do have some mountains in England, by the way, but not as big as the ones in France. But anyway, we do have some mountains. But there still is. I think it's a general thing in all cyclists wherever you are. Although you're quite right, I'd be very very interested to do a study, and also the more the sort of classics type riders, the cyclocross in Belgium and whatever, that might be a slightly different situation. Although again, I did have a cyclist in the study who was actually more of a cyclocross rider than a road rider, but nevertheless, he still was under this illusion. In fact, he was one of the people that was restricting his carbohydrates. So I think it's just, I think it's a pervasive thing that is about, by the way, I have to say, not just in cycling, but in many sports, and including dancing. So it's something that we need to, like you say, going back to this, the whole point of this being to raise awareness across the board that actually, life is such that there aren't shortcuts or quick fixes, and you can't look at anything in isolation. There isn't a magic, you do this and then suddenly you win everything. You have to put it, and also the context of the individual. So, everyone is slightly different. And just because this other athlete, that's the other thing I get a lot. Oh, well, so-and-so is eating X, Y, and Z. So if I eat X, Y, and Z, then I will become as good as that person. But of course, we're all individuals. Everyone's got slightly different, physiological makeup. So it's not one size fits all, really, is it?
Yeah, sure. To complement this topic, you make quite a funny analogy in your website, I think, the L for Performance, where you wrote, "Don't ride your bike like an astronaut." Could you please tell us a little bit more about this analogy, and how important do you think that nutritional education should be to improve the cyclists' eating behaviors?
Yeah, so that analogy, my husband found this very interesting paper, The Bone Health in Astronauts, because we all know if you're an astronaut and you go up in space, there's no gravity, so there's no mechanical stimulus, osteogenic stimulus for the skeleton. And so when they come off the space shuttle or whatever, you can often see they're being carried off because they've actually lost a lot of muscle tone, but also a lot of bone mineral density. And in this paper that he found, over spending 6 months on the International Space Station, the astronauts experienced a 2% loss in bone mineral density. And then suddenly, guess what the figure was for our cyclists that did negative nutrition? 2% over 6 months. So that's why it was like, oh my goodness. Go up in space, no gravity, be a cyclist, an athletic cyclist, and restrict your nutrition, and your bones, you lose the same amount of bone mineral density. So that's why it was just a little bit of a interesting comparison. And my husband found a picture of the astronaut. They try and simulate gravity up there, so they do some exercise of the guy sitting on a little turbo in space. That was just, as you say, an interesting little analogy. So I think going back to and the other question you make about, trying to encourage cyclists and athletes in general to be aware of REDs and realize that there is a danger in restricting your nutrition. You won't get the performance benefits you expect. If anything, you won't perform to your full potential. And there are some quite sort of bad negative ones. Although I don't want to focus too much on the negative. I think really, as a doctor, you can try the scare tactics with patients, but in my experience, that doesn't work. As you say, we shouldn't hide it and say, look, you're going to lose your bone health similar to an astronaut. You can mention that, but actually focusing on the positive, all the things that take control of these behaviors, then you're going to make your hormones happy. And you're going to not only improve your health in terms of your bone health, but actually you're going to improve your performance. And, right at the very beginning, as an athlete, as a dancer, it's all about the performance. You want to perform to your best, to your full potential. So it would just be really frustrating for a cyclist if, you're a good cyclist, but you could be even better if you took this, you read this paper and saw that by eating, appropriately, for the training load you're doing and doing some skeletal loading, you're going to perform better to improve your performance and to your full potential.
That is surely a positive message to leave. So just to wrap things up, not only to raise awareness, okay, we have been raising awareness on the podcast, but this would be just like a brief summary. Do you believe that, for example, integrating more sports nutritionists on pro cycling teams would contribute to decrease the low energy availability and all the negative outcomes that may come from it? And maybe working as a team alongside doctors, cycling coaches, because ultimately we all want the athlete to be performing at his best, right?
Yes, I think that's really, really important. The multidisciplinary team. And I've just written the website for BASEM, British Association of Sports Medicine, called Health for Performance .co.uk, which I recommend everyone to look at. It's this is a non-profit thing. It's an educational website, and I've put all the information there. It's applicable to athletes, cyclists, dancers, and I made it into sections for the athletes, for the coach, and for the healthcare professionals. But everyone can look at everyone else's section. You see what I mean? So I know some doctors are a little bit closed shop, but I think everybody we're all on the same team. And the way I work also is if I have an athlete or dancer I'm concerned about, of course I speak to them in detail, but also I ask their permission, can I speak to your coach? Because the coach has to be. And most coaches, I have to say, I've never had a problem with a coach saying, oh, no, you're wrong or something. The coach is very willing and happy to take on board comments or suggestions that, I say, well, actually, I think this athlete probably just needs to tone down their training intensity or something, whatever it is, and work as a team. I think that's crucial. And, of course, the nutritional aspect of it, absolutely. I mean, I think probably the pro teams are okay, but it's more the amateur athletes, the amateur cyclists, like we discussed, are the ones that I'm probably going to fall through the net, if I can put it that way. I mean, it's a tricky one, but hopefully things like this educational resource where everyone can have a look, it's open to all, the coach can have a look, the athlete can have a look, a sort of a self-help. I think that's quite important because not everyone can, if you're an amateur cyclist, say you're paying a coach, I mean, you're not necessarily going to be able to pay for a nutritionist as well, you see. But if the coach can be on board, part of the team, educated, look at the website or whatever. And we're also in the UK, we've got a thing going called Train Brave, which is a campaign to raise awareness for the athletes and coaches. So we go and talk about the potential pitfalls of low energy availability and, telling them about this study with cyclists so they can see there are positive outcomes. So yeah, I'm in total agreement with your point that everyone is working for the same thing, for optimizing the health and performance of the athlete. They're the ones right at the center.
So, okay, perfect, Nicola. If people want to contact or just follow your updates on social media, is there any way people can go to?
Yes, well, if you, my website, Nicky Keay Fitness, and then also I'm on Twitter, and Facebook, I'm even on Instagram. So I'm sure if you put the link to my website, that there you'll see all the things, and also a link to the, BASEM, the website I mentioned, Health for Performance, that's got, more specific information about, REDS, raising awareness, etc.
Awesome, Nicola. This was just fantastic. I truly thank you for being on the show and for shedding some light on this issue. And I really hope we have raised some awareness for this.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been, been really fun discussing with you.
So that was it, guys, for episode number 5 with Dr. Nicky Keay. Bare bones in cyclists. Time to bring real nutritionists into the sport. I think the title is pretty self-explanatory on what is the reality of pro cycling. The bone health of cyclists is unfortunately comparable to those of dancers and to those of astronauts. And the reason, apart from the lack of load-bearing impact exercises, is intentional low energy availability from food restriction. And when I say pro cycling, I don't mean just the World Tour teams, but also women UCI teams, pro continental teams, and all other amateur levels. We need to progressively start including nutritionists into the sport and stop relying on the physiotherapists, coaches, and doctors to do this. Each of these professionals has its own role as part of a cycling team already, but nutrition is for the nutritionists, period. And I know I've been insisting way too much already on this throughout the episode, but we have reached a state of mayhem in which everyone seems to be an expert in nutrition these days. I see cycling coaches that do online courses now calling themselves nutritionists, and people actually believing in them. The same goes for coaches who take a master's degree with the nutrition name on it. I know some may disagree with me, but taking a master's degree in nutrition, if you don't have a basis academic degree in nutrition, won't magically convert you into one. If so, I can also take a master's degree on physiotherapy, and now all of a sudden, I'm a physiotherapist. That would be nice. I could give massages while prescribing diets to cyclists. I'm sorry for my sarcastic tone, but this is a subject that needs urgent action to stop intrusion in the nutritionist profession. We have gone from playing with the cyclist's performance to now be jeopardizing cyclists' health. Bringing more nutritionists into the cycling world won't magically turn the cyclist's bare bones into steel, of course, but it will help prevent bone mineral loss through focused nutritional basic strategies, along with other fueling and recovery strategies that only experienced sports nutritionists are capable of performing in a balanced way. Surely not through alkaline diets or taking gluten out of your diet, as I still see in the cycling world. Thank you so much for bearing with my grumpiness, guys. Feel the Pedal podcast is now finally available on iTunes, so make sure to subscribe if you wish to know when the next episodes are released. I am Gabriel Martins, your host. Thank you so much for tuning in, and talk to you soon.